Brigadier General Eflant, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Colonel John Hickson from the Center for Army Leadership, and I want to thank you for joining us for our Army Leader Exchange speaker series. As with all Army Leader Exchange sponsored speaker events, just a quick reminder that unlike many of your guest speakers this year, this event will be broadcast on Facebook Live and is therefore for attribution. We will archive it on Army Leader Exchange Facebook page, and it can be rewatched at a time of your convenience and used as part of your leader development activities in the future. Our guest speaker, Mr. Ori Brafman, is a lifelong entrepreneur and is currently a distinguished teaching fellow at University of California, Berkeley's Haas School of Business, focusing on improvisational leadership, data science, and artificial intelligence. He holds a bachelor's degree of science in peace and conflict studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MBA from the Stanford Business School. Mr. Brafman is a multiple New York Times best-selling author. He specializes in organizational culture, employee engagement, business transformation, leadership, and emerging technologies. Of note, he's the author of the very popular book entitled The Starfish and the Spider, The Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations, published in 2006. His most recent best-selling book, Radical Inclusion, What the Post-9/11 World Should Have Taught Us About Leadership, was co-authored with General Retired Martin Dempsey, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Mr. Brafman has advised all branches of the U.S. military, the White House, the National Academy of Sciences, and NATO. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ori Brafman.
Good morning. How are you? I want to start by telling you the story of my dad. He is an electrical engineer. We actually moved to America because of him. And about 5 years ago, he developed what looked like a lesion on his face. And I kind of grew up in a weird family. I grew up vegetarian. My parents were really opposed to antibiotics and traditional medicine. So my dad goes online and starts finding different cures for what looked to be like skin cancer. And he kind of tries everything. He puts mud on his face. He put cannabis oil on his face. As a surprise, none of it worked. But he had this huge fear of the quote-unquote medical establishment. And 6 weeks ago, his condition had gotten so bad that he was starting to bleed profusely from his face. And we get this call, my brother and I, my brother's a psychologist, we get this call from my mom saying that my dad fell and he was almost unconscious. And we go over to their house and we try everything to kind of get him to go and finally get medical care. And nothing really works, and ultimately I put on a hoodie and go outside with a stick and bang on his door, on his window, and my mom and my brother's like, look, it's the angel of death coming to get you, you need to go to the hospital. And he finally agrees to go to the hospital and goes to this regional hospital and then goes to Stanford Medical Center. So he goes from basically medicine circa 1600 to, Stanford Medical Center, where he's now on this experimental treatment. But when we take him to the hospital, he wakes up the next day and he's still kind of out of it. And he asked my mom, where is this place where people are so helpful and they're so nice? She's like, the hospital. So in trying to prevent his biggest fear, my dad actually made it happen. And when it happened, it was actually kind of a joyous experience. And I think about that. I teach at UC Berkeley, and I think about our country, and we think about the fears that we have of each other and why we have these fears. I want to start getting into that today. But for me, being on the stage in front of an Army group is facing one of my fears, and hopefully it's a joyous experience. You guys will find out, right? So I have some good news and bad news. First, the good news, this is my mom. I was born in Israel, So after every, it means I have a Jewish mom. So after every single presentation, right, she wants to know how it went. If I disappoint you, I disappoint her. I will do my best not to disappoint you. The bad news, as you can tell, I have a little bit of an accent. When I was 9, moved from Israel to Texas, so shalom, y'all. We moved here when I was 9. This is what I was expecting. And this is what we got. Anybody recognize this? El Paso, Texas. Now, when we landed, my brother and I actually thought we were crash landing. And any aviators in the audience? You know how you know if there's an aviator? They'll tell you. I want to talk to you about this aviator, this guy named Jacob Van Zanten, who was in charge of the safety program at KLM Airlines. He was literally the poster child for the airlines. And he was known for two things. He was known for being on time and for being in charge of safety. And he had just finished running a safety program for the 747s when he was back in the cockpit for the first time. And there was this chartered flight from Holland to the Canary Islands. And when he's in the air, he gets a message that the airport he was going to, there's this terrorist scare, so he gets diverted. And he lands in this little tiny little airport in Tenerife. And this is tiny. Like, the people in the tower are actually watching a soccer game. They're distracted. But for Van Zanten, there's a couple of things going on in his head. The longer that he is on the ground, the more likely it is that he needs to have a mandatory crew change, and the passengers will be stuck there. So he tries to do everything he can to get out of there on time. He tries to refuel early, whatever he can, just get me out of this airport. And then ultimately, he gets refueled. The other airport opens up, and a fog goes over the airport. And then he does the unimaginable.
We have 700 meters visibility here now.
Wait a minute. We don't have ATC clearance.
We're going.
Captain Van Zanten, highly stressed, knowing that he has to take off or abandon the flight. His crew, aware that he's done wrong but frightened to tell him. Disaster is now inevitable.
God damn.
The head of safety for KLM Airlines takes off into a foggy runway without getting ATC clearance. Now, what's going on? Like, why would he have done this? Pressure? What else? Pride? Principle? Yep. And you also have to ask, what was his crew doing, right? Why were they not stopping him? And what kind of command climate did he create where they're not able to say, hey, pause for a moment before you take off without clearance? And part of my challenge today is the hero of the story is going to be a starfish. But spiders are kind of hua animals, right? You kind of want to root for a spider rather than a starfish. My job would be a lot easier if it was the tiger versus the starfish, right? The cobra, the badger, even the abominable snowman. The last challenge I have is the subtitle of my book, The Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations. Talk about a Pinko Kami word, right? Leaderless. For this presentation, I want you to think about leader-full organizations and what it means to have everyone in the organization play the act of a leader. And for this, we're going to go back in time a little bit to this guy named Hernan Cortez. In the 16th century, he was one of the most powerful men in the new century. And he shows up with 80 men and 80 horses to present-day to Mexico City, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And he marvels by the pyramids, the roads, the complexity of the civilization. But he's not there really to sightsee. What is he there to do? Gold, right? He's there for gold. So you're Hernan Cortez, and you get you're the Montezuma, the Apache leader. And you get an ultimatum. He says, give me all your gold, I'm going to kill you. What do you say? No. Okay, I had to jump up from the stage for that. Whoop. So unfortunately, Montezuma isn't as brave as an army officer. Montezuma says, okay, I'll give you all your gold. And Cortez is not a man of his word. He kills Montezuma and then blockades the Aztec capital. Within 2 weeks, 200,000 people die. And within 2 weeks, the entire Aztec civilization is conquered. And there's a bunch of reasons why the Spanish were so effective. There's the introduction of new weapons in the form of horses, right? There's the introduction of biological weapons in the form of the diseases that the Spanish brought with them. But you can't ignore the fact that 80 men and 80 horses were able to conquer an entire civilization. And the Spanish do the exact same thing with the Inca just a few years later and conquer the Inca. And by the end of the century, they have an effective control over the entire South continent. And it's with the winds of victory in their backs that they show up in my old stomping ground and encounter the Apache. And unlike the Aztecs, the Apache didn't have any pyramids, they didn't have any roads. What else didn't they have? Anybody been to El Paso recently? Not a lot of gold there, right? So the Spanish are like, well, the next best thing is you can take on our lifestyle. And some of the Apache agree, but some of them stand up. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Apache leadership model had these folks called non-tons, who were the leaders. And the phrase, you should, does not exist in the Apache language. So when the Spanish took over one non-ton, another one would take its place, people like Geronimo. And the harder that the Spanish fought against the Apache, the more decentralized, the more powerful they got. This is the Apache territory when the Spanish first encountered them. And after 200 years of first fighting the Spanish, then fighting the Mexicans, then fighting us, the Americans, this was the territory. It more than doubled. The harder that we fought against the Apache, the stronger the Apache became. Any of this sound a little bit familiar? The reason for that takes us back to biology. When I was 3 years old, I had a friend named Danny. I don't really know what became of him because his hobby was to take the legs off of ants, right? What happens when you take the leg off of a spider? Well, it doesn't die, it hobbles around, right? And you take off the head. What happens if you take off the arm of a starfish? Why? Regeneration, because there is no central head. This is not a Photoshop. This is an arm of a Linkia starfish growing an entirely new starfish back. And you think about that as a metaphor for what's happening in business and society. And we're going to fast forward to 2001. There's this kid who liked to take a lot of naps. So what does friends call him? Napster, right? And do you guys remember what the Napster business model was? Free music, right? Like this kid uploaded a bunch of music to his server and let anybody listen to it. Now, what if you're the head of the music industry? What do? You sue, right? We're Americans, we sue, of course. It's an open and shut case here, right? It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court rules in favor of the music industry, and Napster goes out of business. But remember, the harder that you fight a starfish, the stronger it becomes. In trying to fight Napster, we all of a sudden now have Emule. No one knows who created Emule. It's so decentralized. Who are you going to sue? Now I'm going to show you something that my mom probably does not approve of. Anybody know about the Silk Road? What's going on in the Silk Road? Human trafficking, drugs, you name it, it's going on there. It's this eBay essentially meant for any sorts of illegal activities. It gets all the commerce does on a special browser called Tor. You know who developed Tor? US Navy. All of the exchange is done on Bitcoin, a decentralized currency based on Starfish. So there's all this illegal stuff, and you're the DEA. What are you going to do? So they try to figure out who's in charge of this thing. And the US Postal Service happened to intercept a package from Canada. And the package had in it 8 different passports, and they had the same picture of the same guy, but different names. So they're like, maybe we should follow this guy around. And unsurprisingly, they follow him to the San Francisco Public Library. And he's sitting there on his computer, and a couple of FBI agents distract him as they grab his computer before he can close it, and they find out that he's actually the guy who ran the Silk Road, this guy. They arrest him, and they charge him with murder for all the people who died because of the overdoses from the Silk Road. He gets a life sentence. And they take down the Silk Road. How long does it take the Silk Road to go back online? A couple hours. And the first guy was Dread Pirate. There's now a new guy named DEFCON. They arrest him, take down the Silk Road again. Silk Road is still around. The harder that you fight a starfish, the stronger it becomes. Now we can sit here and we can say, well, the music industry, God bless them, the DEA, well, they're working so hard. But I would say these are incredibly intelligent people who just are not recognizing the basic DNA that makes starfish so effective. And we're going to look at 2 elements of the DNA. The first is circles. Right when my book came out, I heard from this guy named Neil Cole, and he told me about something called the home church movement. And as the name suggests, the home church movement meets instead of in churches, inside people's houses. And because it hosts about, it's a living room, it hosts about 15 people. And once you grow beyond that, they grow into a new church, and then a new church, etc. And Neil is a pastor in this home church movement, and he says, can you come to San Diego, and can you come visit us and talk to us? And I'm like, I teach at UC Berkeley, hint, hint, hint. I was born in Israel, hint, hint. He's like, no, it's good, just come to the home church movement. And it's a room kind of like this, but rather than people being in uniform, it's a small room, and it has a couple hundred people. And I guess, how many people do you guys think the home church movement has? A couple 100,000? 1.2 million? That's very specific, yeah? Any guesses here? My guess was 200,000. It was way off. The conservative estimate is 200 million. This is the biggest religious movement that none of us have heard about. And it's especially powerful in India and in China. In China, you can't meet inside of actual churches. The harder that you fight a starfish, the stronger it becomes. And when you think about these starfish networks, you think about Bill W., the founder of AA, who starts a circle with 8 folks. And AA is so effective that they decide to have Overeaters Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And you basically have to let these circles kind of do what they want to do. So you think about it for a second. You're the AA circle of Leavenworth. And all y'all here are the AA circle of San Francisco. And something bad happens in San Francisco. Leavenworth, does it prevent your ability to actually have AA meetings? The thing about the circles is that they're incredibly resilient, and you don't know what will be the second and third order effects. The same thing happens when you write a book. As I said, I teach at UC Berkeley. You can guess my politics. My book ended up in the hands of the Supreme Court, and Justice Thomas gave a copy of the book to his wife, Jeannie. Jeannie is a conservative activist, and she gave a copy to this guy named Mark Meckler, who lives in Sacramento and used the book to start the Tea Party. Unintended consequences. But for a moment, think, who's in charge of the Tea Party? Is it this woman? She claims to, but she's not really in charge. Is it this guy? His name is Keith. He is a blogger who came up with the idea. He's in charge. This woman is named Kelly. She is one of the first Tea Party protesters. Is she in charge? Or does it even matter? Because leadership in these kind of organizations actually can be understood through Julie Andrews playing back-to-back roles in 1964 and 1965. Now, I know there's a lot of musical fans out here, right? What happens at the end of Sound of Music? They walk over the mountain. You guys didn't do this in your core training, right? They go over the mountains, but at the end, she also marries the dad. And what happens at the end of Mary Poppins? She flies away. When you think about it, it's exactly the same movie, right? There's a dysfunctional family. There's a woman that comes in. They sing a lot of songs. At the end of Sound of Music, she marries the dad. At the end of Mary Poppins, she gets out of the way. And think about that as a metaphor for leadership. And think about that in the context of modern-day non-tons. Remember, non-tons were the Apache chiefs, where the phrase "you should" does not exist. If you follow them, you can. If you don't want to follow them, you don't have to. I'm going to show you a video, and I'm going to promise you it's a really boring video, but an important one, okay?
Alright, so here we are, one of the elephants. Cool thing about these guys is that they have really, really, really long fronts, and that's cool. And that's pretty much all there is to say.
Okay. So we learned something about elephants. Why is this video so important? First YouTube video from 2006. I showed this video. I know we're live streaming this, so I shouldn't say the name of the company, but it ends with Crowsoft. And they're like, why are you, this is 2006, they're like, why are you showing this? This is just going to be a bunch of cat videos. And they didn't see the power of it before Google snaps it up for about $1 billion, and think about the value of YouTube today. And the thing about these organizations is they tend to kind of pop in without us expecting them to. And they're kind of changing the world, really, because they're so decentralized and because they operate by a different set of rules. Which brings me to this guy. So 10 years ago, I get a call from this guy who's a 4-star general. I had never had a conversation with someone in uniform. So my first question was, is there a 5-star general? Apparently there isn't. I didn't know what to call him, so I called him Marty. And it brings me over to Tradoc, at the time he was in charge of Tradoc, and he says, how can we make the Army more Starfish-like as we're facing a more decentralized network opponent? And my initial reaction is, I don't know. You guys have way too many consultants out on the outside who tell you a lot of this is the answer that you can have, and then the world will be fixed, and I don't pretend to be that. Rather, I think what we do is we tend to talk about, we need to build trust, therefore we need to A, B, and C. as opposed to why don't we just focus on building trust? Why don't we just focus on building networks? And we started a program right here at CAC to create networks of 12 people, 16 people, 30 people who get together in a very decentralized way to try to take on specific problems. And you think about kind of your role right now, or even the role of the current chairman. And think about the threats that we're going to have to face. So we took care of this guy. But what's going to be our next threat? Is it going to be this guy? Or is it going to be this guy? And the thing is that we don't know, right? We don't know. How do you prepare? How do you go from, 17 years of fighting networks to now fighting a more conventional war? And what's that conventional war going to be like? And who's it going to be against? So the Army is saying, well, we need to be agile. Therefore, we need agile leaders, which breathes really well, right? Now, raise your hand if you've ever heard of someone who is really rigid, who goes to like a one-day training and become really agile. 5-day training, right? I think that instead of thinking about agility as a personal trait, we need to think about it within the context of a network. And specifically, the nodes of the network need not be agile. So for a moment, allow me to use this example of, let's say you're in a terrorist group, and let's say you're trying to blow up a bridge. You're going to maybe get some folks who know about ammunitions, maybe people who know about cell phones, right? And those specific nodes are going to be activated depending on the context of the situation. They're not agile themselves, but they're activated depending on the context of the situation. If you're going to launch a cyber attack, you're going to activate nodes that maybe know about IP protocols or hacking or whatever it is. Depending on the context of the situation, different nodes are going to be activated. The question becomes then, how do we build these effective networks? Now, don't think that Spider is always bad and Starfish is always good. If you're trying to get equipment from Kansas to Afghanistan, I want a very Spider approach to do this. What gets really interesting is the combo special. Specifically, how can you create Starfish within Spider organizations? And this brings us back to Neil Cole from the Home Church Movement. I saw him a few months ago, and it was this convention for home church folks. Now, check out where he's sitting. It's an auditorium that's actually bigger than this one in Texas. Traditional churches have realized that in order to be effective, they need to bring the home churches inside. And that Starfish actually is able to bring your power. And our new book, Radical Inclusion, talks about how do you create these networks of inclusion within very structured top-down organizations. The first element is how do you innovate within a very resource-constrained environment. And I want to talk for a moment about civilizations. They leave stuff behind, right? The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese. Yet one of the most effective conquerors in history, Genghis Khan, didn't leave any monuments behind. Genghis Khan was incredibly effective because he would assign 8 ponies to every rider. There were these flat stirrups that you could stand on while you rode. There was a compound bow. There were arrows with holes in them. Anybody know why there were holes in them? Aerodynamic, what else? So you can hear them as they're coming. This is psychological warfare. This is what it looks like. There's stories of the Mongols actually blockading an entire village, killing everyone in there except for a couple of people so they can live and tell about it to other folks. This was the Mongol Empire in the beginning of the 13th century, and this was the Mongol Empire at the end. If anybody tells you can't win a land war in Asia, tell them about the Mongols, right? And what they did leave behind are bridges. More bridges than any society has left. If you've ever had tea with a Russian, that's because the Mongols brought tea from China to Russia. If you ever had lemon chicken, it's because the Mongols brought lemons from Persia to China. If you've ever seen this guy using cards, it's because the Mongols used playing cards as a way of doing commerce within the kingdom. If you ever used these numbers, it's because the Mongols brought them Arab numbers from the Arab world to the rest of Asia. Anybody try to do division using Roman numerals, right? Kind of hard. And it was because of this, the Silk Road, not the one that has a bunch of illegal stuff in it, the original Silk Road. And within a day's march, you could have these protected places where different people from all over the kingdom were able to share information. And this is actually how innovation happens. The recontextualization of something from one element to it being used in a different one. And yet we have this myth as a society of the lone genius, of Archimedes, of Steve Jobs. His friends call him Bill, no. Of Steve Jobs, right? Now let's listen to Steve Jobs in his own words talk about how he came up with the Apple operating system. And this is when he visits Xerox PARC.
And they showed me really three things. But I was so blinded by the first one that I didn't even really see the other two. One of the things they showed me was object-oriented programming. They showed me that, but I didn't even see that. The other one they showed me was really a networked computer system. They had over 100 Alto computers, all networked, using email, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't even see that. I was so blinded by the first thing they showed me, which was the graphical user interface. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever seen in my life. Now, remember, it was very flawed. What we saw was incomplete. They'd done a bunch of things wrong, but we didn't know that at the time. It's still, though, they had the germ of the idea was there, and they'd done it very well. And within, 10 minutes, it was obvious to me that all computers would work like this someday.
Now, Steve Jobs would never ever steal anything, would he?
I mean, Picasso had a saying, he said, good artists copy, great artists steal. And we have, always been shameless about stealing great ideas.
What are the great ideas that exist within your organization that are just right underneath your nose that you can effectively steal? And how can you create an environment of trust, a network, so you can actually find out what those ideas are? Now, I'm going to show you a film clip, and these are people doing the Lindy Hop. I want you to pay special attention to their feet, okay? This is a few years later from the BBC studio. Pay attention to the feet. Anybody recognize who this is? Not Fred Astaire? Not Gene Kelly? Muhammad Ali.
Ali just danced like Fred Astaire that night, just like he was in a jitterbug contest. And Ali had the lightness and the swiftness and the quickness of feet, connected with his body, his hands, his arms, his head, all together. He never danced like that again. And that was just something to behold.
He had a ball that night. He was a happy character because the ring was his domain, his kingdom. And when that bell would ring, he would really take over.
He takes the Lindy Hop, puts it inside the boxing ring. Surely there's some new innovation, right? This is from 1982, the Apollo Theater. Pretty original, 1950s. Which is to this guy. Anybody speaks Russian? You will soon. Okay, Russian speakers. Pyotr Ufimtsev was this Russian mathematician who in the 1980s had this kind of theory about how geographic planes deflected radiomagnetic energy. And this was the height of the Cold War. The Russians cared so little about what he had to say that they actually let him publish internationally. Publishes internationally, these engineers at Lockheed Martin look at the research and run an experiment. They put an object underneath the radar, it disappears, gives us stealth. The Russians had everything they needed in order to have stealth. They couldn't see it. Anybody recognize what's going on here? So there's a lens, there's some transistors, and then that information is recorded. My undergrads are like, what's that? It's cassette tape? This is the world's first digital camera. Comes to us in 1974, developed at Kodak. Kodak decides to shelve it because they're afraid that it will compete with their film business. Think about, again, the innovations that already exist in your own organization. And how do you build capabilities through networks of inclusion? And what we mean by this is in organizations, what typically happens, if we want to kind of be inclusive, is we distribute the what, right? We have a suggestion box, a bunch of ideas. And I would say, like, you know, ideas are great, but there's plenty of ideas. You actually need to really concentrate the what. Make a few people who are in charge concentrate the what, tell you about why the what is important, and how you achieve, and how you know whether you've achieved the what. And then you distribute the how. Get a bunch of different people to be able to chime in about how to achieve the commander's intent. Which brings us to Silicon Valley. I live in San Francisco. I teach at Berkeley. And quite a few people, both from defense and from industry, come out and visit Silicon Valley because they want to understand what is the magic that makes Silicon Valley kind of tick. And they tend to look at two elements of Silicon Valley. First, they look at tech. They look at companies like eBay, like Google, which are all kind of around San Jose. And then they look at the finance, the money, Sand Hill Road. So there's a lot of money, there's a lot of tech, and they try to understand that. But I think that in trying to understand Silicon Valley from those perspectives, you're only looking at 2 points of a 5-pointed star. And in order to really understand what's happening in Silicon Valley, you have to look first at the art that's happening in San Francisco. San Francisco is an art-based town. A portion of every new building, the money from every new building goes to public art. It's a place that kind of engenders creatives. You need those kind of people in the mix. You need to look at what's happening in the East Bay, imagination at UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley was started as a mining school, right? So you imagine that there's gold available in those hills. Now you imagine, hey, maybe there's civil rights are possible. Think about imagination. And the fifth element of the star, the one that sounds kind of the weirdest, is the soul of Silicon Valley. And that's Burning Man. Right? You're not going to go in front of a group of army people and talk to them about Burning Man, but let me try. Everyone knows about Burning Man? Good. So Silicon Valley isn't a very religious place, and I would argue that Burning Man is as close as it comes to a religion. And the religion really has two rules. The first rule is if someone does something, you get out of the way. And the second is if you want to, you can help. The Burning Man Festival is inclusive, not necessarily in who's able to go, because it's kind of a pain to actually get all the way there, and they only sell 80,000 tickets. But where they are incredibly inclusive is once you're there, the ability to participate. This is a video from a few years ago at Burning Man. You'll see me at the end in a green jacket. I don't know if it's a jacket, but...
So we didn't really have any idea of how to build an art car, and we said, well, what could we do that we could just put something on top of a car? And Tom thought of, well, how about a deck? And we basically built a kitchen deck, or a barbecue deck, whatever, on top of a car. We took a bunch of conduit and hinges and one of those little universal joints that comes with your ratchet set, and we attached the conduit with hinges to the gas and the brake pedal. We have a piece of PVC pipe attached to the gear shifter, and we have a piece of rope that just pulls on the brake. And hopefully it works.
The reason I think Burning Man is becoming more and more relevant is because it allows participation. And as we continue to have dominance on the physical space in the world, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the opponent. If you're going to be fighting a war against us, we're not going to probably do it's going to be very difficult to fight a war for geography. So instead, you're going to fight a war over time. The competition is going to be trying to get as much time as possible. And I mean that in a literal sense. There's a competition for time. This is a video from Facebook. This is the Facebook president talking about the corporate model.
You know, if the thought process that went into building these applications, Facebook being the first of them to really understand it, that thought process was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you, more likes and comments. I mean, it's a social validation feedback loop that it's like it's exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. And I think that the inventors, creators, and it's me, it's Mark, it's the Kevin Systerman at Instagram, it's all of these people, understood this consciously, and we did it anyway.
So the business model here, we've talked about going from hierarchy to networks. And what we're arguing in the new book is that there's a new business model where the narratives, the videos, are the organization. You think about the stabbings in 2015 in Tel Aviv, where this guy goes, stabs someone outside of a bus stop in Israel, and that goes up on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and then people do copycat events because of that video. But there's no one actually in charge of trying to promote that video. And you think about videos are the actual organization. And you need to think about them through a biological perspective. Videos, like any other living organism, need to do two things. First, they need to eat. And the way they eat is they consume viewership. I'm going to show you a video. This is from a couple of years ago. These people were parking their truck, and a woman in a Prius gets upset and comes and talks to them. There is a little bit of salty language here, but I think you'll be okay.
I came over here because it was quiet, because there was nobody here, and you come up here with your gas-guzzling piece of shit, and the exhaust is spewing everywhere.
Hey,
and
don't
you're
you
sitting
swear
there.
in front of my
Shut the
daughter.
fuck
Get
up.
out.
Okay. When you type in Prius to YouTube, this is the #1 video that shows up. Now remember, Toyota is kind of in the business of selling cars. They're not like, they're happy to sell trucks. But think about it from the perspective of Toyota, right? All of these videos. The second thing that videos need to do is, in order to survive, is they need to reproduce. So as a response to this video, these people started doing something called coal rolling, which is you run your diesel truck dirty, and they did that in front of Prius owners.
That's great!
There we go. It is locker talk.
They eat and reproduce, right? Think about the terrorist attack a couple years ago in France, where this guy drove in Nice. Gets viewership, and then they reproduce. France, England, New York. How do we battle this effectively? How do we win this non-kinetic war over time? And what we have to grapple with is something that we call the digital echo. So a couple of years ago in Bangkok, this guy set up some fireworks. People didn't know it was the middle of the night, so they kind of go on Facebook and Google, and they try to kind of find out what happened, which triggers an automatic alert, a safety alert on Facebook. So Facebook has this safety alert, and they're like, hey, there was an explosion. And they accidentally, this was no bad intent whatsoever, post a video from the BBC from a year earlier about an actual attack. And that got tied in to the safety alert from Facebook. When you go into Google today and you do a search for Thailand bombing, you get the wrong information. Which brings us back to my dad. Remember I told you in the beginning, my dad in Silicon Valley, trying to find all of these cures to try to find his cancer. It's not like there was ill-intentioned people trying to sell him snake oil. Well, maybe there were. But how can someone who has an engineering degree get all of this bad information? And when the bad information gets repeated so quickly, how do we distinguish between what's actually accurate and what isn't accurate? And you think about that in terms of the implications of even what's happening in Syria, right? Was there a chemical gassing, and how do we verify that? And then in order to verify the information on the ground, you need to be able to have people on the ground who are trusted, who are part of your network of inclusion, in order to get the better information out there. You need to use inclusion to draw knowledge from the edge of the network. This is how garbage cans are actually saving lives in hospitals. Anybody recognize what's happening here? Let's not look at it too long. This is antibiotic-resistant staph infection, MRSA. More people die of MRSA in the United States than of HIV/AIDS every year. And the best place to get MRSA is the hospital. Do you know how you prevent MRSA? Wash your hands. We've known this since the 19th century. So all these hospitals, this is the Albert Einstein Medical Center, they went on a campaign to try to get people to wash their hands. They put up signs above the sinks that said, wash your hands. Anybody thinks that those worked? Sounds kind of familiar, right? So they put up bigger signs about washing your hands. Anybody think those worked? So they sent people to a day-long training about washing your hands. Anybody thinks that worked? Information does not change behavior. I'll repeat it. Information does not change behavior. If it did, all of us would floss, none of us would smoke. So instead of just blaring information at people, the Albert Einstein Medical Center assembled everyone from the organization, from the head of infection control to the janitor, this guy named Jasper. And Jasper noticed that in wings where there's a lot of staph infection, the garbage cans were empty. We're like, that's weird. Why are you using? So there's a model where you say, nothing about me without me. So we all went to this wing and we said, why are you guys not using gloves. Didn't you know you need to do this in order to prevent MRSA? He said, well, the nurses in this wing, we have extra small hands. And this hospital is so cheap that they don't give us enough extra small gloves. We're like, well, what if we give you more extra small gloves? Then, of course, we'll use them. The janitor busts out a pen, writes down his number. Every time they run out of extra small gloves, they call him up. 5 minutes later, he refills them. It was small incremental changes like that within a year reduced infection by 70%. Now, it's not to say that every single wing should have extra small hands, or extra small gloves, nor is it to say that Jasper, the janitor, should be made the head of infection control. But rather, depending on the context of the situation, you empower the network and you get the different nodes to give you the information depending on when it's needed. The same thing is happening in the military. I couldn't get an actual picture of people clearing a room, but as you know much better than I do, clearing a room is a very dangerous thing, especially if the room is going to be booby-trapped. A very young soldier comes up with the idea of, what if we spray silly string inside of there? And then we know whether the room's going to be booby-trapped or not. Again, what are the answers that exist inside the organization, and how do we amplify those? The fourth implication is that we have a new generation that is operationalizing play. And it's easy for people to look at this new generation and say they're self-absorbed and all sorts of stuff that I don't think is actually accurate. I think we need to look at them in the context of toys. Specifically, this is a toy from the year 200. Anybody recognize what's happening here? Steam. Yeah. There's a fire that's heating up a cauldron filled with water. The water then evaporates, creates steam. The steam then makes this thing rotate. It took us 2,000 years to apply this in a steam engine. I'm going to show you a video from University of North Carolina. This is doing finals, and just to let off some steam, get it? Students, yeah, right? Went into the library. This is a flash mob. No books were heard in making this video. When Occupy started, the way that they told people about the event was through flash mobs. And they weren't able to have amplified sound. So what they would do is the person would stand in the front, and he or she would say something, and then the front row would repeat them. And then the other rows would repeat what they heard, and it's called the human microphone. This is what it looks like.
Each other's voices.
We amplify each other's voices.
So we can hear one another.
So we can hear one another.
So we can hear one another. There is no hierarchy.
Hierarchy.
At the end, they do a deaf clap. Everyone do it with me. Deaf clap. Come on. There you go. So let's see what he's saying. We're all part of this movement. We amplify each other's voices so we can hear one another. There is no hierarchy. And rather than looking at what he's saying, let's look at how he's saying it. Anybody see anything interesting? He's speaking in tweets. Right? So all of a sudden you're taking flash mobs, you combine them with speaking like tweets, and you have Occupy. You can say, well, nothing ever happened to Occupy. And I think that dismissing Occupy is like saying nothing ever happened at Woodstock. We need to look at the second and third order effects.
People ask all the time, like, who are the leaders? Like, well, none of us are leaders, and we're all leaders, exactly the same.
And we fast forward a couple of years, and Walmart is starting to have problems in terms of its minimum wage, right? And there's all these protesters that are coming in. See if there's anything that looks familiar about these protests. it's the Occupy folks. And now they're starting to affect Walmart. And all of a sudden, these videos are becoming the narrative that other people are starting to replicate. In order to win this battle, we need to change the context of the conversation. And this brings us to the state of nature. Fight or flight, right? And when you have a fight or flight reaction, your body releases cortisol. It's what makes our mouths dry. It's what makes us kind of tense up. Were it not for cortisol, we wouldn't be in this room today because our ancestors didn't know to wake up in the middle of the night when they heard a loud bang. And you see it everywhere in nature. If they could, they would almost do this, right? 60 years of research have proven fight or flight. Two UCLA researchers looked at all of this mountain of data, and they found a big problem. All of the research was done on one group of people, on men. And they noted that when they have a stress reaction, they sometimes also tend and befriend. And when you tend and befriend, your body releases oxytocin. There's a lot of misinformation about oxytocin. What we do know about it is oxytocin is the hormone that's released when a mother gives birth. And you look at your child for the first time and you fall in love with your child, and you forget how bad it was and you're willing to do it again, that's oxytocin. How do we get releases of oxytocin? And how do we change the context of the conversation? So check out this cartoons and check out the fish on the right. And when American kids had to describe what's going on with this fish on the right, what would you guys say? Leading, faster, smarter, better. When you show the exact same cartoon to kids in China, they'll tell you this fish is being pushed away, it's not part of the group, and that if you actually show the fish to kids in Hong Kong, half the time they'll give you the Western interpretation, half the time they'll give you the Eastern interpretation, and you can cue which interpretation they'll give you based on whether you show them a picture of McDonald's beforehand or a traditional symbol. Which brings us back to UC Berkeley. So a lot of my friends, right, kind of look like this. And the first program I ran here at CAC, there was, I don't know if you guys still, do you still have to do like a public speaking assignment? No? Okay, well, used to. And people would go and they'd go kind of to the community and talk about the Army, but they would go usually at Leavenworth. And these two students were like, hey, what if we come to UC Berkeley and we talk there? And I said, hey, that's kind of interesting. And there was a class on war at UC Berkeley. It has 400 people. They've never had anyone in uniform talk at the class on war. So I brought a couple of people over, and it was so good that they invited people the next year, and they showed up in uniform. And what was really interesting is that no one protested against them. There was no one spitting. And I would say that's actually one of the bigger challenges for Department of Defense. The fact that Berkeley students are indifferent about what you're doing is even worse than being, at least having an opinion about something. And I would wager that there's a possibility that your average Iraqi and Afghani is more likely to have interacted with someone in uniform than your average Berkeley student. Regardless, they came in and they spoke about just their experiences in war. This was not a political conversation, it was just a human conversation. And there was this woman sitting next to me in this kind of this hippie dress, and I see her starting to cry. And at the end, 40 folks or so from the class sat on the grass and just talked and just had a very human conversation. And it's made me kind of reflect, what if we start having more of these networks? What if we just start with the network and bridge the military-civilian divide that way? So every year for the last couple of years, we've had 30 folks come to UC Berkeley for 12 days. And they live right across from People's Park. And they spend time with the community. And they had to do a community volunteer project. And I said, well, I have a crazy idea. What if we get the Army folks to help volunteer at a Burning Man event? What could possibly go wrong? So this was an art event. This was all volunteer run. And we had all the different guys start helping. And the artist that you see here in the crane is like, who are all these people helping? And it was kind of like my dad being like at the hospital saying, like, who is all these people helping me? And it's like, it's the Army. And they're like, the Army's here? So the Berkeley City Council hears about this. And they convene a special meeting. And they pass a resolution. It's a unanimous resolution that declared that day Bridging the Military-Civilian Divide Day. And if Berkeley and the military can work together, think about what we can do as a country. I want to finish by showing you a couple of videos. This is a video of people who go up to the Alps and they strap a parachute to themselves as they go skiing down, okay? Okay, how does it feel? Exhilarating? A couple weeks ago, I showed this video to a group of risk managers, and they're like, the liability! But it's kind of hard charging, right? It's kind of like, maybe it's a little bit of a cortisol release. Now we're going to watch the exact same video. And on this other video, one of my friends just changed the music underneath. And just see how it feels. How does it feel? Serene, calm? Maybe you can see the artistry in it. It's the same exact content, delivered in a slightly different way. And if for whatever reason as a country we're sitting here afraid of each other because of the digital echo, because of the perceptions that we have of each other, is talking to each other in a different way, in a different format, change the conversation enough where we can see the beauty. I'll tell you, I probably have the only electric car in San Francisco with an Army Strong sticker on it. So if a vegan Berkeley guy can be here, how can we as a country get together in a way that is more inclusive, that is a way that focuses on beliefs? And I'll tell you the last story, also right around here at Baldwin, Kansas, which is like about an hour away. I was sitting in a hunting lodge, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, so here I am, this vegan in this hunting lodge. There's all these like animal heads and bears and all this stuff. And this guy's talking to me about bow hunting. And I'm listening, and he's like, you know, you Berkeley guys aren't that bad. And what I would say is when you take politics away, our core values as Americans are actually pretty similar. The values of service, the values of sacrifice, If we can and we can just focus on that and what unites us and what we have in common, then perhaps we can be slightly more inclusive. And perhaps we can together then figure the how of trying to create a better world. Thank you. Oh, you're already up there. That was very stealthy. I was like.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have an opportunity for question and answer with Mr. Brafman. We have panels circulating around, so please get a panel attention, and we'll get your question. Panel 1.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for coming today. I'm Major Fiore from Staff Group 2 Charlie.
Woo.
Thanks, guys. Hey, I have a question about these concentric circles in this network. We form teams rapidly in the Army. How long does it take to build and then propagate one of these types of organizations?
I would say my experience is that there's a lot more of a Starfish networks on the pointy end of the spear than in a garrison environment. Interestingly, these form very quickly when lives are on the line. And as I've come to learn, oftentimes when people fight, it's for the person to their right and to their left and on their behalf. The question is, how do you get that level of innovation? And how do you bring it back to an environment that is more garrisoned? And I think there's this challenge of no one gets fired for not innovating. So if I had to do an acquisition of some vehicle, and I could either spend X dollars on the normal vehicle, or I could spend X dollars plus $1 million for a little bit more of a shield, then I'm going to spend more money because potentially it can save American lives. So we live in an environment where, because lives are on the hook, we're going to be less tolerant of crazy innovation. So the question becomes then, you have innovation requires variance, right? And I'll tell you, not all ideas are great. Some ideas suck. How do you basically weed out the good from the bad? And what I've seen is that a lot of that has to happen through innovation within groups. So if I were to tell you guys to all form groups of 12, like let's say there's a mission and you try to figure out the how. How do you reduce drunk driving incidents? Whatever it is. And I let a bunch of people to come up with their ideas. I then test the ideas. I then listen, amplify, and include those ideas that are effective, and then I replicate those kind of ideas. So the entire idea here is that you take innovation away from the individual and put it more in the hands of a team. Is that helpful?
Panel 1.
Good morning, sir. Major Dan Curran, Staff Group 7 Delta. As we look at the idea of digital echoes and we apply it to school shootings that are going on now, I'm wondering if you can, if again we look at the ideas that you brought up of open discussion or wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands, it had no effect. And right now the common theme is guns are the problem, guns are the problem, guns are the problem. Maybe they aren't, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Do you have any thoughts on how we could approach that through another mechanism in a manner that you've brought up or that you've discussed today?
I think that the Parkland kids are doing some remarkable things. And I think we really need to pay attention to what they're doing, because their focus isn't just on legislation, it's also about the norms of whether this is okay or not. I think that there's going to be a debate, and debate, as you well said, debates are about being right or wrong. And I think we're no longer in the age of debates. I think we're now in the age of competing narratives. And narratives are either interesting or boring. I think what the Parkland kids are doing is incredibly interesting. I think that you saw the same thing even in the previous election. I think you saw a debate of ideas, and I think that whether it was climate change or whether it was guns, and people don't want to have debates, but people are much more inclined to have a competition of narratives. What is more interesting? And I think that in this day of the digital echo, whatever is more interesting is going to be winning. So think about it from a perspective of violent extremism online. Rather than trying to take down all of these videos, all of these very violent videos, which I wish they didn't exist, there's efforts to try to amplify voices for tolerance. There's this guy I know named Mansour, wonderful guy. He runs something called Muslim Marines. He's a Muslim Marine. And right now, he's actually created a campaign of 29 for 29. So every day of Ramadan, he's getting a veteran to come to a Muslim American family and spend the day with them. And that is actually kind of compelling. It's really interesting. I love what this guy is doing. And if that then becomes the narrative, then we don't need to have a debate about whether Islam is a religion that's A or B. We can actually see what's more interesting. MuslimMarine.org.
Panel 2, please.
Sir, Major Jamie Schwant, Staff Group 9 Delta. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on swarming or swarm intelligence, or even the OODA loop and its application to what you presented today?
I think we're going to have a lot more swarming behavior. And what I'm starting to really pay attention to is how Andy Warhol said that in the future we'll all have 15 minutes of fame. How people are achieving their level of fame by trying to contribute to a video. And when we've typically thought of swarming behavior, it's been from a group doing something, and it's groupthink or whatever it is. And I think that now it's moving to a video compelling folks to actually start taking action. And if we recognize that that's the world that we live in, then we need to start shaping and affecting what videos are getting people to do.
Panel 2.
Hey, sir, how you doing? Brad Cooley, Major Brad Cooley from Staff Group 10 Bravo. My question for you is, you talk about acceptance and debate, yet UC Berkeley has been in the news quite a bit for protesting against conservative speakers from sharing their ideas at UC Berkeley. So how are you able to reconcile that with your own student population?
With difficulty. My advisor was this guy named Joe Nealand. And I graduated Berkeley in '97. And this was the height of the AIDS crisis. And there was a guy, I forgot his name, who spoke on campus. And he wanted to, he had this hypothesis that AIDS isn't caused by HIV, it's caused by drug use and lifestyle. And it was getting kind of a lot of flack. And I remember talking to Joe Nealands about this, and Joe said, I owe it, from an intellectual place, to go and see this guy speak, to hear him out. And unfortunately, I think that that spirit has died down in universities and I think has died down in our countries. So I think that we are a free speech campus. I think we need to encourage free speech in as many places as possible. Now here's where the digital echo comes in. So about a year ago, this guy named Milo came to campus, right? And there was a whole lot of hoopla over the protests that emerged after this. And there's different narratives that are going, that were being talked about. The first narrative is that he came on campus and then students totally went out of control and threw Molotov cocktails at the student building. And the next day, you have the administration saying, hey, we're going to defund Berkeley if it's this out of control, which makes sense, right? Now, that's one narrative. There's another narrative that developed right at the same time, and it said, you know what? The people who threw the Molotov cocktails weren't students. They were paid agitators from the right. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Neither one of these narratives actually makes sense. Why would students, I can see students being upset that Milo was there, but I don't know if they would actually throw Molotov cocktails. And the second narrative is, why would anarchists, of all people, accept money from the right in order to be agitators? So I went down to the police station, and I interviewed the police spokesperson and said, what actually went on there? And she's like, the campus has never seen anything like this. And I said, did you make any arrests? And they're like, no, we made one. I was like, you only made one arrest, but the campus is going, and they're like, yeah, we were that scared. So then I said, well, let's think about it through a radical inclusion perspective. And I started asking around. And I ultimately found a student who knew someone who was part of that protest. And it turns out that there was a couple of thousand people protesting Milo, which I'm good with, like it's free expression. But that there were 100 of them who weren't students who were actually protesting the Amazon store on campus. And they were upset that Amazon is selling books on a public university, which I don't agree with them, but I understand that concern. And that as they were protesting, and they were throwing actual rocks at the Amazon store, there was a structure that was illuminated, and it fell over, causing a fire. And then someone tweeted saying, there's Molotov cocktails being thrown on campus. And then the police seized the social media activity, and they respond as if there were actual Molotov cocktails, but they weren't. This is the digital echo. So the story of Berkeley being totally out of control isn't necessarily accurate. At the same time, I think you have a very valid point that we need to be much more tolerant to different debates and different points of view. But I think that the debate gets so amplified, and we start being so afraid of each other that it no longer becomes accurate.
Panel 4.
Morning, sir. Major Brent Nelson, Staff Group 1 Delta. Quick question. I know we talked a lot about kind of the social media side and information, the culture of information. What are your thoughts on changing the culture of misinformation and sensationalism in the mainstream media, mainly news outlets like CNN and Fox News?
Tell me more.
Just kind of, we talked about kind of the viral trends that exist on YouTube and different things like that. But a lot of the information that people get is via the mainstream media, such as your major news outlets that are polarized and a lot of sensational. Everything's breaking news, headline news. So how do you change that culture as a national media?
I would say it's very hard and it's very challenging. I think that this might be a first step. So let's go back to the situation of Syria. And how do I know that there was poison gas in Syria? If I hear something on the news, probably my next phone call is going to be to someone in uniform to say, like, what do you actually know about this, right? And me being able to get on the phone with someone or get on an email with someone is going to improve my ability to get information. In a similar way where you're saying, like, hey, what the heck is actually going on in Berkeley? If you can call me, and I can be like, well, here's kind of my perspective, is that as news becomes more sensationalized, and specifically as news becomes shorter and shorter, right? As it becomes 30-second clips where it's harder to explain things, and as more and more people are able to produce news, you need people on the ground who are going to be able to verify what's accurate and what's not accurate. And then we need to think about that there's a bunch of narratives and stories floating around, but we need people on the ground to actually verify them. And we need to build these bridges in order to be able to call the right person depending on the context of the situation.
Panel one.
Good morning, sir. Christina Shelton, Staff Group 7, Bravo. You made a great point about the tip of the spear, achieving circles and networks. And so from my point of view, decentralized networks are prevalent at the tactical level, or the lower echelon, if you will. But as we move up the chain of command at the higher echelons, I see that our leaders either forget or don't see the value of decentralized networks and execution, and there's a tendency to want to control more, either the narrative or how we do things. So my question for you is, what advice do you have for senior leaders in the Army, or even for us here that will work at the higher echelons, to achieve that balance between centralized and decentralized?
I do a program, I've been doing it for the last 8 or 9 years, with all the 1 and 2 stars. And they're coming about cohorts of about 20. And one of the activities I do is, I have these like oversized playing cards. And they each get a card, they kind of draw a card. And they put it on their forehead without knowing what card they are. And ace is high, 2 is low. And we pretend that they're at a company picnic. And their job is to find out what they are, what card they're holding up. And it's weird, I've had to like cover up the mirrors because the generals are trying to cheat. And I was like, no, this is a game, right? And what inevitably happens is the aces and the kings will be right here, like hanging out. And then the 2s and the 3s, the low cards, are all on the other side of the room. And at the end, I get them to line up without looking at their own cards from ace high to 2 low. And about 95% of the time, they line up perfectly. And then we go and we debrief, and I said, 2s, how did you know you were a 2? And people said, well, you know, someone came to me and said, you're doing a great job, please carry on, and you know, like, how are the family and kids, and remember to work hard. And I asked the ace, how do you know that you're the ace? And it's really easy, everyone comes up and sucks up to them. Calls them sir, and I've done this in a division unit with a CG and his direct reports. The CG drew a 3 in uniform and was standing in the corner as people were treating him like, oh yeah, thanks for your interest in national defense. I would say that you're all, especially if you do well, you will be putting an ace on your forehead, on the battalion level, on a brigade level, maybe even on a division level. And at the moment that that happens, and we only have one ace that I see in the room, the moment that happens is all of a sudden people start laughing at your jokes. They think you're the most amazing, interesting person. And it's just human nature. I do the exact same thing with Berkeley students. And they go into the exact same world. This is human dynamics. And you're wearing your rank on your uniform. So rather than thinking about this as people being kind of like overly controlling, think about the situation. Think about an hour-long meeting that you've had. The first thing that we do, right, we have someone stand up, they speak, everyone nods, and is that the best way of getting information from the edge of the network? And then if you think about that as a human psychology thing that you need to keep on fighting, that you will, as friendly as you are, as nice as you are, as good of a listener as you are, you will be the ace when you go into that room. And that wearing that ace makes you see information in a different way. Can I put you on the spot, my ace in the room? Yeah, sorry, can I put you on the spot about, is that right? Like, did you feel like, when you put on the star, did you feel like you started kind of like, your jokes became funnier and? How do you, I'm totally putting you on the spot, but how do you kind of try to overcome that? Overcome this? Go home and talk to your dog. But remember, this is a human psychology question. This is not just a military question. This is a human psychology question once you dawn on the ace.
Mr. Brafman, on behalf of Lieutenant General Lundy and our audience, both here in the auditorium as well as on Facebook Live, thank you for engaging us with your wonderful perspectives on human interaction, organizations, networks, and leadership. This presentation will add to our professional body of knowledge as we move forward into advanced leadership roles. Mr. Brafman will be signing his new book at the Lewis and Clark bookstore from now until 11:30, and then at the PX after lunch from 13 to 1500. Thank you all for attending, and please join me for thanking Mr. Ori Brafman.